The evening was still. Jeffrey sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a book, his fingers occasionally flipping the pages more out of habit than genuine interest. He struggled to focus. The atmosphere was heavy with unspoken tension, but neither he nor Angela acknowledged it. From the living room, the rhythmic sound of Angela's typing echoed a mechanical heartbeat that filled the house. Jeffrey glanced at the clock on the wall. It was late, but Angela showed no signs of stopping. She was engrossed in her laptop, her eyes glued to the screen, her fingers moving purposefully, lost in something that had nothing to do with him. He knew what she was doing. It wasn't work, it was something else, something that had been gnawing at him for months. Angela's voice suddenly broke the silence, startling him. "Are you coming to bed soon?" she asked, her tone light, but with an underlying sharpness that didn't go unnoticed. Jeffrey looked up, meeting her gaze for a fleeting moment, before forcing a smile. "In a bit," he replied, his voice calm, revealing none of the turmoil brewing inside him. He watched as she turned back to her screen, the glow highlighting her face, a face he had once loved unconditionally, but now saw as a mask concealing lies. He had known for a while now. The signs were all there, the late nights, the sudden attention to her appearance, the coldness in her touch. But the confirmation had come one night when she left her phone on the kitchen counter, unlocked. A message from her boss, Patrick, a message that changed everything. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Maybe you can wear that little red dress I love so much. Your husband doesn't appreciate you like I do. He's clueless, just like we planned." Jeffrey had read the message twice, each word cutting deeper than the last. But instead of confronting her, he buried his anger, masking it with a facade of normalcy. He played the part of the oblivious husband perfectly, while secretly crafting his plan, a plan that would make them both pay. As the night dragged on, the tension in the house became unbearable. Angela closed her laptop and stood up, stretching. "I'm going to get ready," she said casually, as if it were any other night. "All right," Jeffrey replied, watching her walk up the stairs. His eyes followed her for a moment before he turned back to his book, though his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't help but think about the times when they were genuinely happy. Their life had seemed picture perfect, or so he had thought. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. Angela had changed, or maybe he had just been too blind to see it. The love they once shared had withered, replaced by something hollow and toxic. Jeffrey got up from the table and walked over to the kitchen sink, staring out the window into the darkness. The perfect suburban street lay before him, with its neatly trimmed lawns and identical houses, a place where nothing bad ever seemed to happen, at least not on the surface. He heard Angela coming down the stairs and turned around. She was dressed to kill in the little red dress from the text, the one Patrick loved. Jeffrey's blood boiled, but he kept his face neutral. "How do I look?" she asked, twirling slightly, her eyes not truly seeking his approval. "Beautiful," Jeffrey said, his voice steady, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. She smiled, satisfied with his response, and grabbed her purse. "We should go, don't want to be late." Jeffrey nodded and followed her out the door, locking the house behind them. As they walked to the car, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of the end. He had been preparing for this night for weeks, but now that it was here, a part of him felt almost detached, as if he were watching someone else's life unfold. The drive to the party was silent. Angela was lost in her thoughts, likely thinking about Patrick and what the night would bring. Jeffrey, on the other hand, was concentrated on the task at hand. He had gone over his plan countless times in his mind, ensuring everything would go off perfectly. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming control, about making them pay for what they had done to him. Jeffrey's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white as he fought to keep his emotions in check. Angela sat beside him, adjusting the strap of her red dress, a dress he knew all too well from the message he had read. It hugged her body in a way that would have once made his heart race, but now it only served to stoke his anger. "Are you looking forward to the party?" Angela asked, her voice overly casual, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Should be fun," Jeffrey replied, his tone flat, revealing nothing. Angela glanced at him, sensing the tension, but said nothing. They continued in silence, the distance between them feeling vast despite their physical closeness. They arrived at the venue, a large upscale hotel where Patrick was hosting his company's annual party. The parking lot was filled with luxury cars, a testament to the wealth and influence Patrick wielded. Jeffrey parked the car and turned off the engine, taking a deep breath. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. "Ready?" Angela asked, Her voice filled with a forced cheerfulness that made Geoffrey's skin crawl. "Ready," he replied, opening his door and stepping out into the cool night air. They walked into the hotel together, arm in arm, appearing like the perfect couple, but underneath the surface, Geoffrey was seething. As they entered the grand ballroom filled with people dressed to impress, he scanned the room, searching for Patrick. Angela's arm looped through Geoffrey's, a gesture that felt more like a formality than a sign of affection. The doors opened to reveal a room full of guests, all laughing and chatting, their voices mingling with the soft jazz playing in the background. The scent of expensive perfume and cologne mixed with the aroma of Hors d'oeuvres being passed around by waiters in crisp white shirts. Geoffrey recognized many faces, colleagues and their spouses, people he had shared drinks with at previous company events. Tonight, though, they were nothing more than unwitting players in the drama about to unfold. His eyes quickly scanned the room, spotting Patrick at the center of a group, holding court like a king surrounded by his loyal followers. Patrick's presence was unmistakable. It didn't take long to notice him. He was tall, handsome, and radiated confidence, the kind of man accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. Tonight, Geoffrey was going to take it all away from him. "Let's grab a drink," Angela suggested, already heading toward the bar. Geoffrey followed, his eyes fixed on Patrick. He watched as Patrick noticed them, excused himself from the group, and walked over with a smug smile. As they approached, Geoffrey noticed a subtle change in Angela's demeanor. She became more lively, her smile more genuine, as if Patrick's presence brought her back to life. Geoffrey's stomach churned, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had a role to play tonight, and he couldn't afford to lose his composure. Patrick spotted them and grinned, his teeth gleaming in the soft light. He spread his arms wide in an exaggerated display of warmth. "Geoffrey, Angela, so glad you could make it," he said, his eyes lingering on Angela, the look in them unmistakable, though he quickly masked it with a friendly smile aimed at Geoffrey. Geoffrey greeted him with a nod, his voice steady. "This place is impressive. Wouldn't miss it." Geoffrey forced a smile. Patrick chuckled, clapping Geoffrey on the back a little too hard. "Perks of being the boss, right? You know, I've been thinking we should get together more often. You and Angela are such a lovely couple." Geoffrey forced another smile. "That sounds like a great idea." Patrick turned to Angela, his eyes resting on her a little too long. "You look stunning, as always," he said, ignoring Geoffrey entirely. "Thanks, Patrick," Angela replied, her smile sincere, a smile she hadn't shown Geoffrey in a long time. Geoffrey's hand tightened around his glass, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was all part of the plan. He just had to bide his time. Jessica, who had been chatting with another guest, turned her attention to them, her smile warm and genuine. "It's so nice to see you both," she said, her voice smooth and pleasant. "Angela, that dress is stunning." "Thank you, Jessica," Angela replied, her smile seeming almost too bright as she returned the compliment. As the evening went on, Geoffrey played the role of the attentive husband, but his focus was on Patrick and Angela. He observed as their hands brushed briefly when they both reached for the same appetizer, and as they exchanged secretive smiles when they thought no one was watching. Patrick was the picture of charm, effortlessly balancing conversations with his guests while sneaking glances at Angela whenever he could. The familiarity between them was sickening, but it only solidified Geoffrey's resolve. At one point, when Patrick was briefly alone, Geoffrey seized the moment. He approached Patrick with a drink in hand, offering it to him with a smile. "Here's to a successful night," Geoffrey said, raising his glass. Patrick grinned, clinking his glass against Geoffrey's. "I'll drink to that. This company's going places, and it's all thanks to the great team we've built." Geoffrey nodded, taking a sip. "Speaking of the team, I wanted to talk to you about something. There's been some chatter in the office, not a big deal. Just some concerns about the direction we're heading." Patrick's smile faded briefly, but he quickly recovered. "Concerns? What kind of concerns?" "Just the usual," Geoffrey replied smoothly, "but I thought it might be good to get ahead of it. Maybe a meeting with the higher-ups, a chance to address any issues directly." Patrick's eyes narrowed as he considered Geoffrey's words. "I see what you mean. We can't afford to let any doubts fester. Let's schedule something next week." "Sounds good," Geoffrey agreed, his tone casual, though inside he was boiling. He knew Patrick would brush off the concerns as minor, just like he dismissed anything that didn't benefit him. As the night wore on, Geoffrey's anger simmered just below the surface. Every laugh, every exchanged look between Patrick and Angela felt like a knife twisting in his gut. But he kept his emotions in check, waiting for the right moment. He needed to be patient. He had meticulously planned this night and wasn't about to let his rage ruin everything. The evening had settled into that familiar late hour where the music was softer, the laughter quieter, and guests had started to pair off or cluster in small groups, lost in private conversations. Geoffrey stood at the edge of the garden, sipping his drink and watching. He had been waiting for this moment, letting the alcohol work its magic on the crowd, loosening tongues and lowering guards. It was time. He saw Patrick and Angela slip away from the main gathering, their bodies angled toward each other as they moved to a secluded corner of the garden. Patrick's hand brushed the small of Angela's back, a gesture so intimate it made Geoffrey's blood boil. Yet he forced himself to remain composed. This was not a moment for anger, this was a moment for precision. Geoffrey set his glass down on a nearby table and followed them, his steps measured and purposeful. The gravel crunched softly under his feet, and he could see them now, standing close together under the dim light of the garden lanterns. Patrick was speaking, his voice low and smooth, and Angela was laughing, a sound that once would have brought Geoffrey joy but now felt like a dagger to the heart. Patrick was the first to notice Geoffrey's approach. He turned, a lazy, mocking smile spreading across his face. Well, if it isn't the man of the hour enjoying the party," Geoffrey said as he stopped just a few feet away, his gaze shifting from Patrick to Angela, who quickly averted her eyes, her face tense. "I was," Geoffrey replied, his voice calm, "but I think it's time we clear the air." Angela's posture stiffened, her fingers nervously twisting around the stem of her wine glass. Patrick, on the other hand, seemed to enjoy the confrontation, but he leaned back slightly, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Oh, and what would that be about?" Geoffrey stepped closer, closing the gap between them. He kept his voice low, compelling them to lean in, their focus entirely on him. "I know everything," he stated, articulating each word slowly. "The late nights, the secret meetings, the lies. I know what you've been doing behind my back." Patrick's smirk grew wider, his arrogance blinding him to the danger in Geoffrey's eyes. "Is that so? And what are you going to do about it?" Geoffrey. "Run to HR? Get a divorce? Come on, man, you're out of your league here." "Listen, loser, I've been with your wife for years. She prefers my Big Johnson to yours, right, babe? And you know what? Your kids are mine too." "You idiot." You didn't even notice Geoffrey's lips curled into a humorless smirk, sending a chill down Angela's spine. "Actually, I was thinking of something a bit more dramatic." For a fleeting moment, doubt flickered across Patrick's face, his confidence wavering as he searched Geoffrey's expression for a clue. But Geoffrey gave him nothing. He turned to Angela, who was now visibly trembling, her composure cracking under the pressure. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper only she could hear. "I've been patient, but now it's time to end this." Angela's face paled, her eyes wide as she looked up at him, speechless. She opened her mouth to speak, but Geoffrey silenced her with a glance so cold it froze her in place. He turned back to Patrick, who was now frowning, his bravado unraveling. "You think you're untouchable, Patrick, that you can take whatever you want without consequences?" Patrick straightened, trying to regain his composure. "What are you talking about?" Geoffrey inhaled slowly, savoring the moment. He had been waiting for this, the perfect line to set the stage for what was to come. "Just like I did with your wife," he said, his words heavy and deliberate. Patrick's smirk faded as the meaning of Geoffrey's statement began to sink in. He blinked, struggling to comprehend, but Angela's sharp gasp confirmed his worst fears. She stared at Geoffrey, her hand flying to her mouth in shock, while Patrick's face turned pale, his usual swagger replaced by dawning horror. "You're lying," Patrick said, but his voice lacked conviction. It sounded more like a plea than a statement, his bravado crumbling under the weight of uncertainty. Geoffrey stepped back, crossing his arms over his chest, his expression cool and detached. "Am I?" he asked, letting the question hang in the air. He watched as the doubt in Patrick's eyes grew, the cracks in his confidence widening with every passing second. And then, as if on cue, the distant wail of sirens pierced the night, growing louder and more distinct. The sound cut through the quiet garden, interrupting the muted conversations of the other guests. Heads turned, whispers spread, and a ripple of unease began to move through the crowd. Patrick's eyes widened, his face paling as he turned toward the sound. The wail of the sirens grew closer, more threatening, and the realization that he was trapped began to settle over him like a heavy fog. The confidence that had fueled his arrogance all night was now replaced by a growing panic. Angela glanced from Geoffrey to Patrick, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Jeffrey, what did you do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jeffrey didn't answer her directly. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed on Patrick, who was now visibly sweating, his hand clenching and unclenching at his side. "I warned you, Patrick," Jeffrey said calmly. "I told you there would be consequences." The sirens were almost upon them now, the flashing lights reflecting off the manicured hedges surrounding the garden. The guests began to murmur among themselves, some moving toward the front of the mansion to see what was happening, others exchanging worried glances. Patrick's bravado had completely vanished as he looked around desperately, searching for an escape route, but finding none. "You're bluffing," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "There's no way you could have." Jeffrey cut him off, his voice low but firm. "You thought you were untouchable, Patrick, that you could take whatever you wanted and destroy lives without a second thought. But you underestimated me." The first police car pulled up to the entrance of the mansion, its red and blue lights casting eerie shadows across the lawn. The guests began to scatter, confusion and fear rippling through the crowd as more officers arrived, stepping out of their vehicles with determined strides. Patrick turned back to Jeffrey, his face now pale and drawn. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "You can't do this." Jeffrey stepped closer, lowering his voice to a menacing whisper. "I can, and I have. You're going to pay for everything you've done, Patrick. You and Angela." Angela recoiled, as if struck, tears welling up in her eyes. "Jeffrey, please, you don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Jeffrey replied, his tone icy. "I understand that you both thought you could make a fool out of me, that you could carry on your little affair without any consequences. But you were wrong." The police officers began to move through the crowd, their expressions serious as they scanned the faces of the guests. Jeffrey watched as they approached, his heart pounding with anticipation. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the culmination of months of planning and preparation. Patrick backed away from Jeffrey, his eyes darting between the approaching officers and the man who had once been his friend. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice filled with desperation. "You'll regret this, Jeffrey. I swear you'll regret this." Jeffrey didn't flinch. He had no intention of letting Patrick's threats shake him. He had come too far, sacrificed too much to be swayed now. "It's already over, Patrick," he said quietly. "You just don't realize it yet." Patrick, his face pale, tried to regain his composure. "What's the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice trembling as his eyes darted from Jeffrey to the officers, seeking some semblance of normalcy, but finding none. A tall officer with a sharp gaze stepped forward, his badge gleaming under the flashing lights. "Patrick Stevens?" he asked, his tone authoritative. "Yes," Patrick responded weakly, his voice barely audible over the growing noise. The officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs and spoke with practiced calm. "Patrick Stevens, you're under arrest. The charges against you include embezzlement, fraud, and other related crimes. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Patrick's face went blank as the words sank in. "You've got to be kidding me," he stammered, trying to protest. "This is a mistake." The officer's expression remained unchanged as he moved to secure the cuffs around Patrick's wrists. "This is not a mistake," he said firmly. "We have evidence. You'll have your chance to explain yourself in court." Jeffrey stepped closer, his voice low but filled with satisfaction. "You didn't think I'd just let you get away with it, did you? All the thefts, the lies, the affair, none of it went unnoticed. I made sure the right people knew exactly what you were up to." Patrick's eyes widened in horror, his previous bravado replaced by disbelief and fear. "You set me up," he spat, struggling against the restraints. Jeffrey shrugged, a cold smile on his lips. "I didn't set you up, Patrick. I just made sure the authorities had what they needed to see the truth." The officers began to guide Patrick away from the garden, his protests growing more frantic. "Angela! Angela! Angela! Help me, do something!" Angela, standing at the edge of the scene, watched in shock. Her hands trembled at her sides, and tears streamed down her face as she took in the chaos. Her world had shifted from comfortable deceit to a nightmare in moments. Jeffrey turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Angela, save your tears. You've made your bed, now you have to lie in it." Angela's lips moved, but no words came out. Her eyes pleaded with Jeffrey, but he didn't waver. He cut her off with a raised hand. "No more excuses. The choices you made have consequences. This is your reality now." Patrick was finally escorted to the waiting police cars. He glanced back one last time, his face a mask of fear and desperation. The guests watched in stunned silence as he was loaded into the vehicle, the reality of the night's events settling heavily over them. As the police cars pulled away, Angela stood alone in the middle of the garden, her once secure life now shattered. The other guests began to drift away, their conversations filled with speculation and shock. The party that had been filled with laughter and celebration was now a scene of quiet disarray. Jeffrey watched Angela from a distance, his mind made up. He had fought to get to this point, to expose the truth and see justice served. Now, it was time to walk away. He turned and started to leave, but Angela's voice cut through the silence. "Jeffrey, wait," he stopped but didn't turn around. "What is it, Angela?" I don't know what to do," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to face this." Jeffrey finally turned to look at her, his expression softening just a little. "You have to face it, Angela. This is the price of your choices." Angela looked down at her hands, which were clasped tightly together, seeking some form of solace. "What about the kids?" she asked quietly. "How will I explain this to them?" Jeffrey's eyes narrowed. "That's something you'll have to figure out on your own. You made this mess, you're the one who has to clean it up." With that, Jeffrey took a deep breath and turned to leave. The night air was cool against his skin, a stark contrast to the heat of the confrontation. He walked away from the mansion, leaving behind the wreckage of his past and the echoes of betrayal that would linger long after the party had ended. As he made his way to his car, the reality of the evening's events settled in. The satisfaction of seeing Patrick face the consequences was tempered by the knowledge of the personal cost involved. But there was no going back now. The reckoning had come, and the fallout was just beginning. In the weeks following the party, life unraveled in ways that no one had anticipated. The once lively suburban neighborhood, typically a peaceful haven, became the setting for a series of dramatic events that caught the attention of both local and national media. The day after the arrest, Jeffrey woke up to find his phone flooded with calls and messages. The media frenzy had begun. News outlets from across the country were covering Patrick Stevens' fall from grace. Images of Patrick, handcuffed and looking defeated, appeared on every major news website and newspaper. The headlines were "Relentless Corporate Mogul Arrested for Massive Fraud." Affair exposed the untold story, and from riches to rags, the Patrick Stevens scandal. Jeffrey watched the news with a sense of detachment. The satisfaction of seeing Patrick's empire collapse was tempered by the awareness that this was just the beginning of a long, painful journey for everyone involved. He knew Patrick's crimes were extensive embezzlement, insider trading, and various other financial wrongdoings. Authorities had been investigating him for months, but it was Jeffrey's detailed tip-off and the evidence he provided that had set the final pieces in motion. Patrick's fall from grace was swift and harsh. The authorities acted quickly, freezing his assets and seizing his properties, cars, and bank accounts. Patrick's once thriving business empire was reduced to empty offices and boarded-up storefronts. His carefully crafted reputation, built over decades, was destroyed in a matter of days. It wasn't just his business that suffered, his personal life was in ruins. Jessica, his wife, filed for divorce immediately after the arrest. Their marriage, once seen as a symbol of high society success, disintegrated as rapidly as Patrick's fortune. Jessica was seen in public only once, hastily gathering her belongings from their luxurious home, where she was met by a crowd of reporters and photographers. "Jessica, how are you coping?" one reporter shouted. Jessica, her face pale and drawn, barely acknowledged them. "I have no comment," she said before quickly getting into a car that sped off. The scene was a stark contrast to the high-profile parties and social events she had once regularly attended. For Angela, the fallout was equally severe. The day after the party, she found herself locked out of her office. Her boss, a colleague of Patrick's, informed her that her position was terminated due to her association with the scandal. "I'm sorry, Angela, but we can't be linked with someone involved in such serious charges," he said, handing her a box of her personal belongings. Angela stood there in shock, her eyes filling with tears, but she managed to hold herself together. "I understand," she said quietly, though the words felt hollow. As days turned into weeks, Angela's attempts to contact Jeffrey grew increasingly desperate. She sent messages and left voicemails, pleading for a chance to explain and beg for forgiveness. "Jeffrey, please. I know I messed up. I'm so sorry. Can we at least talk?" But Jeffrey remained firm, with no desire to revisit the past. Each time he saw her name appear on his phone or heard her voice in a voicemail, he felt a mix of regret and relief. He couldn't allow himself to be swayed by her pleas. The betrayal had been too deep, and he had already made his decision. Jeffrey sold their home in the suburbs, a task that was both physically and emotionally exhausting. The house had once symbolized a life filled with promise and happiness, but now it was a reminder of all that had been lost. The sale went through quickly. The property was desirable, and the market was favorable. Jeffrey packed his belongings with a sense of finality, leaving behind memories of a life that had been stained by deceit. He moved to a new city, far away from the drama that had consumed his old life. The new apartment was small but comfortable, and Jeffrey focused on rebuilding his life, finding comfort in the simplicity of his new surroundings. He spent his days creating a new routine, meeting new people, and discovering new interests. The familiar echoes of his past were replaced by the quiet of a fresh start. Jeffrey found a bit of peace knowing that he had acted decisively and that those who had wronged him had faced the consequences of their actions. He focused on living well on his own terms. The revenge he sought was not just about punishing those who hurt him, it was also about regaining his dignity and moving forward. As time went on, the media frenzy around Patrick Stevens gradually faded, and the headlines shifted to other scandals and news stories. Jeffrey watched from a distance, with his involvement in the affair and its fallout becoming a faint echo in the background of his new life. One evening, as Jeffrey sat on his balcony enjoying the calm of his new environment, he reflected on everything that had happened. The bitterness of betrayal had faded into a distant, muted memory. He had faced the storm directly and emerged on the other side scarred but strong. Jeffrey's new life was far from perfect, but it was his own. He had learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't about dramatic gestures or public displays, it's about finding peace within yourself and moving forward, free from the shadows of the past. As he looked out over the city skyline, Jeffrey felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing that he had chosen to live well on his own terms.